welcome to Elevating Voices in Memoir and Fiction, where we get to listen to authors with fascinating stories. I'm Joelle Tamraz, your host today, and my guest is LL Kirchner. Welcome, LL.
Hi, Joelle. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me. It was such a delight after reading your book and all the synergies in our books to be able to talk to you.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to speak with you too. And just for our audience, they may not realize you've written two memoirs. Your first memoir is American Lady Creature Might Change in the Middle East. And your second memoir, just recently published, well, we can see behind you, Blissful Thinking, a memoir of overcoming the wellness revolution. Got that right. And I believe you also have a novel. Do you want to just tell us a little bit about that before we start talking about your memoirs?
Yes, but I will sidebar. It started off, funny enough, as a memoir of surviving the wellness revolution. But during the pandemic, which is when I was sort of on that path to publication, that term sort of felt loaded. So we went with overcoming. And, there is certainly a lot of burnout around that concept, I suppose.
Yes.
Yeah, anyway. So it's
No, but
funny
that's
that you
good to
tapped
know. It
into
just came
that.
out of my, I've just read your book, but it just came out like that.
Yeah.
Overcoming.
I don't mind. So
No.
yes, during the pandemic, I wrote a novel because nothing seemed to be happening with my book, and it's really a lark based on true stories. I'm sorry, based on a true story that I had come across, where there was this troupe of touring swimsuit models out of St. Petersburg, Florida, during World War II, and I thought, well, what? They weren't famous. Certainly, the idea of variety shows and traveling entertainment was big, but it was your Bob Hopes. It wasn't
Yeah.
like no names out of Florida getting tire rations and gas rations and fabric rations in order to make this possible, right? In other words, it just seemed sort of a frivolous thing during this time that was not necessarily so frivolous. And I wondered, well, how did they have the pull to make that happen? And I thought, well, maybe they were involved with the mafia. And then I thought, I was actually originally going to tell it from the perspective of sort of the store owners and the mafia, but then the girls themselves, hence the title of this book, Florida Girls, became more prominent in the story, more interesting to me, because what was happening simultaneously was this erosion of women's rights. And I felt this connection to these women who at that time, they're sort of seeing, because it starts toward the end, and they're sort of seeing the end of the war coming, and so they can imagine the end of freedoms that they've had with the men away, essentially. And so that's the takeoff point for this book, and the things that they did to try to maintain their freedoms as they had gotten them, and also carve their own way in the world.
Great. That sounds great too. And for your fans, something else to look forward to. So tell me about your memoir writing. How did you always know there would be two memoirs? How did you get started? Just tell us a bit
Joelle,
about
I
that.
didn't know there was going to be one. I mean, I started off as a fiction writer, and I got a degree in journalism, partly because I do love telling stories. And the funny thing is, I went into newspaper writing. I never thought I was not interested in broadcast. Har har. And I went into journalism and realized very quickly, because at the time when I graduated, the idea was that journalists should be objective and report on the news in a factual way. And I mean, you still have news stories that kind of pretend to do that. But I realized very quickly I was ill suited to that. If I would be listening to a politician I didn't agree with or thought was stupid, I would make sure that I included quotes in the story that let readers know how stupid this person was. And I I couldn't I just didn't feel great about that. Anyway, after there had been a shooting and I had to interview this mother about her slain child, I was like, you know what, this is not for me. This is not
Yeah.
enjoyable. It felt gross. Like
Mm.
that's too soon. So I ended up going into kind of PR and marketing, and I wrote fiction on the side. Now, even as a journalist, I never imagined that I would be telling my own stories,
Mm.
right? I wanted to just tell stories. And
Right.
when I first went to Qatar, the idea was never that I was going to write a memoir about it, but I did want to write essays about it because, sort of in the vein of like a Dave Barry, because I
Mm.
would go to the mall and you could smell oud, this incense in the air, and it's mixing with Starbucks coffee, and you see these women, they're wrapped head to toe in black, gliding along on their, tottering on those, well, they don't totter, they glide on those designer high heels right past a Victoria's Secret ad. And there was like a lot of cognitive dissonance. And I wanted to write these witty essays. But then certain experiences transpired that made it really challenging for me to tell the story without putting myself in it. So, for instance, I went through early menopause,
Mm.
and then my husband left. None of these things are a secret, right? They're kind
Yeah.
of on the cover, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah.
But those things, hence the my change in the Middle East. But also when he was gone, and I went into the depths of despair about this because it wasn't something that I thought was going to be happening. We were both unhappy in Qatar, but to my mind, the problem was Qatar.
Right.
And he had gone back to the States to set life up there, and then called me and said that he wanted a divorce. And I was shocked and gutted and just astonished. The rug was just pulled out from under me. I
Mm.
mean, I had our dogs that he brought into the marriage. You know what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah.
it was a very unexpected occurrence, and he just disappeared. Then he wouldn't take my phone calls, he wouldn't respond to emails, and so I was left trying to deal with this in this culture where I didn't have friends or family. I was primarily there to work, and everybody I knew was through work. And work is really not the place to take that in, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
You don't go in and be like, oh, I'm having these terrible hot flashes. Certainly not there, right? My assistant was a Muslim male, for one thing.
Oh my
So,
goodness.
anyway, I had a lot of challenges, and I needed to maintain my sobriety. That's another thing. I had gotten sober as a teenager, and not because my parents sent me to rehab or, it was some sort of slap on the wrist or I was having trouble jogging. Like, I had had a bleeding ulcer. I'd been institutionalized multiple times. I'd run away from home.
Mm.
These are things that were serious consequences of my addiction. And I got sober because of that. Anyway, I had also relapsed after the death of my first boyfriend.
Right.
And so when felt how I felt in Qatar, I knew that I had to do something differently than what had happened when I had been abandoned. And I'm, using air quotes around that because obviously he died by drowning. That wasn't a death that was done to me. It was an accident. And yet it still impacted me, my heart, in the same way. The
Very
heart is
shocking.
not a clever animal. It's not
Mm.
rationalizing, well, the heart's just
Exactly.
like, ouch. And so I felt the same way. I'm getting kind of into the second book because the first book is really what happened when I kind of came to that moment of despair, and I said to myself, well, who's going to want to date me now? I'm menopausal and I'm about to turn 40 and I'm a divorcee. And I had often said, I'm living in this country where women are valued primarily as wives and mothers. And I had to admit, when I said that and to myself, how exactly do I value women if that's truly what I think? And so it was this reckoning of myself as a woman, myself as a feminist, and those sorts of observations. And that was really all that book was about. And this other journey, this more personal journey of how am I going to not relapse now, is kind of what happens in Blissful Thinking. I
Right.
knew that the answer was to attend to spiritual healing. And so I wanted to go on this path. And this was the one that was laid before me. And as you know, since you read the book, that miracle at the beginning really was mind blowing. So I start the book like smoker, and I land in India, and I just suddenly I'm not smoking. I had tried everything to quit smoking, Joelle. Did you ever smoke? Probably not.
No, but
Yeah.
that struck me in your memoir, and I was going to ask you, what do you think happened there? What was it? Something in the air? Do you have any idea?
I honestly, I still don't know. It was, I would call that the grace of God moment. God, my lowercase g God, because I do think that, there are lots of different religions, and nobody really has the corner on what works. I say find what works for you, preferably without, stories that put you down. But
Oh, I thought you were saying preferably without additional substances, but
oh, well, that too. Yeah, but some
yeah,
people that works for them. Some
yeah,
people,
yeah.
like there's a whole lot of people who have benefited from ayahuasca journeys. I became obsessed with the idea that that was the thing that I needed to do at one point in the book. And then my friend Willie was like, "Who are you kidding with that? You just want a
Yes.
free high." And he was not wrong. On some level, I had to admit that that was true. For me, I have to be very careful because my relapse did not come about in a rash moment. It was something I thought about for many years the first time around, and it happened in many small ways. Like I feel like overdosing on aspirin, like taking too much aspirin for cramps, was the gate. That was what started me off on thinking, well, if I can handle that, then I can handle coffee, and I can handle,
Mm,
sugar. These are all drugs, right?
yes.
I have a lot of rationalization that leads to, oh, well, why not just smoke some weed?
Yeah.
So, I know that's what's waiting for me at
So
the
you
end of
so you
that.
so you get to India and you don't feel like smoking anymore. So at this point, it's the grace of God. Something just you just stop wanting it.
Well, that is what kind of really made me think there's something magical about India, obviously, because I've tried to quit smoking. I've lived in a lot of different places and tried to quit smoking. I've had a lot of different spiritual experiences. And I now in the book, I do it as two trips, but in reality, I went to India every other year for that duration of time.
Mm,
And I first wrote the book that way, but readers would say, "Oh, I'm confused about where we are in time and space," because there are always flashbacks within the India chapters. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to just separate and make it more coherent
mm.
narrative, I guess. I certainly didn't set out to write something that was incoherent. So I just tried to streamline it, but keep it in an order that made sense so that, you know, I, I have the experience with the polyamory community in New York before I go to the sex ashram.
Right, right. And tell me how much later after these events happen, the events that you relate in Blissful Thinking, how much later did you then sit down to write them?
That is a great question because I was writing as it was happening. So
Okay.
back to your original question, which was, did you set out to write
Yeah.
this as a memoir? And the answer was no. Like I never planned to write a memoir at all. It was kind of a concession to even write American Lady Creature, I should point there, as essays, like I wasn't even going to write them necessarily as personal essays, but to go from that to making it a memoir, it was such a personal story, and if you fictionalized it, it would not have, I thought, been as successful in terms of the stakes of the story. Because I think when you're trying to bespeak something, because at that time, as you remember, when I came home from Qatar, well, you wouldn't remember. The book came out in 2014, but the events conclude in 2007. And when I get to New York, and
Okay.
what happens is Sarah Palin and Hillary Clinton are these major political figures, even though Hillary Clinton is running for president and Sarah Palin is like the sidekick to John McCain. But it's this whole thing of you can either be a bitch or you can be a bimbo. And
Mm,
I thought, and people would say to me, "Oh, you've just come back from Qatar. They treat women so terribly there." And I think, well, we're not doing that much better here, right?
yeah, yeah.
And that really is what motivated me to want to write that and write that particular story. And I thought the lens had to be personal, and it's the same with blissful thinking. So again, I never planned to write any of this, but I was journaling obsessively. I mean, I shouldn't say obsessively, but I did a lot of journaling at the time because that is how I process things, is through writing. And if I see it, you know, in front of me on the page, then I understand it in a different way than if it's just in my head. I can also process a lot by talking to people, but a lot of times to make it really stick, I have to write it down. So anyway, I was doing all of this journaling without any intention of writing it as a story. And that's, where a lot of the great detail comes from, is because I had it.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. So when did you start to put it together as a book? Blissful Thinking, that is.
I would say in 2013.
Oh,
So American Lady Creature was in that publishing shoot, right? I
mm,
was working with an editor and doing the things you do to get the book out. And I had, in the process of writing that book, I had written a solo show, which actually was a turning point for that narrative. When I wrote it as a performance piece, I recognized how certain aspects of the narrative were not working. So I thought, well, this next book that I'm going to write, I'm going to, because at that point I had decided like I do need to write about these events, but I had a very different idea for the frame of that book. Anyway, I'll talk about that in a second. But when I sat down to write it, I did do a solo show first, and that solo show was just, this is what it's like to go to a 10-day silent meditation ashram. And I had written an essay for the Washington Post, got a great splash, and I had done this solo show, which also did really well. And I thought, great, this is going to be the story. And I got a lot of editorial interest
mm,
in it. However, nobody bought the book, and nobody bought the book, and nobody bought the book. So I thought, well, okay, maybe there's a problem with the frame. Maybe I should, because I was trying to pitch it from proposal.
right.
As you know,
Yeah.
writing a whole book is a lot. And I had only written a few chapters. So I thought, you know what, I'm gonna just have to buck up and write this book and see how it goes. And it just wasn't working. And by 2016, I had decided, okay, forget it. I had an agent who had sort of stopped responding to me. And I thought, well, that's not a good sign.
Yeah.
So I,
So you did have an agent for this book initially.
oh, I had an agent for both books. I've had several agents.
You're prolific. That's great to know.
Yeah.
That you obviously
So
have interested a number of agents, so that's good.
yes. But anyway, so what I realized was that, and this was after my mom passed away, was that I was not telling the right story with the book.
Okay.
The book was much more about reckoning with the wounds that drove me to continually keep having the same pattern repeat. At this point, I was past the search. However, I had been writing about these topics, and I had come across, by 2017, I wrote a piece about this study that Brown University did that showed that insight meditation could actually lead to more anxiety in people who tried to do these long-term meditations. And you know what, Joelle, I had the hardest time trying to place that story. And since I finally did place it, I've gone back, and luckily I saved some version of it somewhere, but they've completely taken it down. It's almost as if anything that goes against the narrative that meditation leads to anything but bliss is just so verboten. It must not be named, right?
That's quite scary. I want to find that article because I've written a similar one from my perspective as
Oh,
TM
interesting.
being the gateway and transcendental meditation.
Yeah, yeah.
So, and what made me so open to magical thinking, and it's going to be great. So yeah, I'd love to read your article, and I'm
Yeah.
surprised it's been taken down because it's
I
important to
can
have these
send you the
varying
link. So
views.
I have it in my portfolio still, like my Contently portfolio. I don't know if
Oh,
you're familiar with that. And it's probably in other links on my own website, but
on
in
your
fact, I'm
website.
not even that sure.
Okay.
But oh
Well,
yeah, I talked to a lot of people for that. I talked to Tara Brock for that. I talked to people who had had negative experiences at meditation ashrams. I mean, it was a fascinating fact finder for me. So I
right.
learned so much through that, and it helped me see my experiences in a completely different way. And I had actually finished the book before I came across Florence Williams' Heartbreak, which is another book. And in it, she talks about her experience of prolonged grief. Now, I got to tell you, compared to my experience of prolonged grief, her experience did not seem like it was so prolonged. Although, I mean, that's easy for me to say. You read a book and you don't
Mm,
really know what the timelines are. But because I was grieving for years and having troubles that would reverberate.
mm,
So the thing that precipitates the final trip to India is this devastating phone call that I had with my ex, or I'm sorry, it wasn't a phone call, it was an email exchange where, even the fact that even now I can still call it devastating is kind of telling. But, in it, he basically blithely told me that he was living the exact life that he and I had talked about living, just with somebody else slotted in. And it really was painful. And I
mm.
was also astonished at how painful that was, and knew that I still wasn't healed. Like,
Yeah.
if that could still hurt me like that, there is something still wrong. Another thing that I did that's not in the book, I don't think, I may make a glancing reference to it. I've edited that so many times. It's hard to recall what's been taken out, because I've taken out stories that I think are great, but in some sense they're repetitive
Mm,
to other material that's in the book, and so
right.
that's not a pleasant read. Like, to me, the most important thing is to make it a pleasant read so that the ultimate message comes across, which is, stop trying to figure out what's wrong with you.
Yeah. No, and you do an amazing job of relaying your experiences in a humorous yet serious and very candid tone. And there isn't this kind of, self-righteousness about the meditations, or we know you're seeking, but you're so good about, I mean, in the first Vipassana meditation, you get this shooting pain and you're sneaking in, I think, your notebook and pen or pencil. And you definitely seem like you keep
And
your
snacks.
rebelliousness. And I wanted to ask you, what do you think kept you grounded? I mean, when some people go out there, and you'll understand from my experience why I'm asking you. So, and you get
Yeah.
completely taken in by
Yes.
whatever is on offer. But with you, there seemed to be some distance from some
Well,
pretty serious experiences. What do
I
you think that
know.
was?
It is a miracle, honestly. Again, but when I said this in the book, it was not glib. Like,
Yeah.
toward the end of the book, I also relay another book that I read, Amanda Montell's
Mm,
Cultish.
yes.
And in it, she defines a cult as any group that separates itself through linguistic conventions. Now, she's a linguist, so
Mm,
no surprise there.
yes.
But I found that so fascinating, because that's one of the things that makes cults so difficult for me, is those hokey linguistic conventions. I've been, a member of the 12 Step community for decades now, and you would not know it from the way I talk. I meet people who have been in recovery for 6 months, and I completely can tell. They don't have to tell me. Like,
Yeah, they use a certain
they'll
language and
they use that language. It's coming out everywhere. And I know people who have been in for a long time who also are the same way. I'm not trying to say that's indicative of not having a lot of recovery. I was just sort of saying,
they
and I
pick it
think
up quickly.
it is something that you can pick up quickly, and it's something that you can really continue to use. And
Mm,
I just don't, it's the same. And I think that Montel makes this case in her book about, even like, she certainly talks about yoga. I mean, I know that language really well,
yeah, right.
Virasana, Shavasana, Kapotasana, like, we could drop into those poses if we wanted to, right? Because we both have done a lot of yoga.
Yeah.
But she says that, like, Orange Theory is and she mentions makeup groups that are even culty.
Okay.
And, I think that resistance to that language, and that is something that I learned from my mother, this love of language. And so I resist when it's being used in a hack way. It
Yes.
just gets my hackles up immediately. I'm like, oh.
Yeah. And but you stayed through your 10 days of the Vipassana
Oh, yeah. And I
twice,
went
I believe.
back. I
And you
went
went
back.
back. Yes.
I went back partly because I thought, well, you know what? It was that cheating. Maybe that's
The
why
right.
this
Yeah.
didn't work for me. And I did it
Mm,
without the snacks, without the journal, without any kind of crutches.
mm.
And my ultimate conclusion there was, you know what? I don't hate myself enough to put myself through this ever
Good,
again.
good for you. And then you, I guess one of your most, outlandish experiences, we can say you went to the Osho ashram. Can I say with an open mind, not knowing what you'd find there, or did you have an idea what you'd find there? Tell us a bit about the experience that now people call like a sex cult.
Right, right. I actually am so grateful for that experience because I think ultimately that had the one of the biggest impacts.
Mm,
And I mean, certainly becoming comfortable with my own agency through sex is part of this journey. And part of that is, to me, in retrospect, of course, so obvious because when someone rejects you like that and you're, in my case, menopausal and getting older,
mhm,
it can feel like a total rejection
mhm,
of your self and self-esteem,
mm,
and discovering that my self was not tied up in my age or how I looked or any of those things was a big part of the journey. And again, that was something that my family really did drill into me. My mother always liked to say, beauty is only skin deep, but ugly goes clear to the bone. And
But I
there's
remember
a lot
that
to
one.
unpack in that little sentence, right?
Yes, yes.
But and honestly, that was one of the reasons why I was not interested in going into broadcast journalism, because I was not going to, the only thing that was valued in my family was intelligence.
Mm,
And if you were putting yourself out there in some way that relied on something about yourself other than your intelligence. So for instance, I have decent cheekbones and, fair skin and fair hair,
yeah.
right? That is a certain look that could be a newscaster,
Mm,
right? And the idea that I would trade on my looks to get something,
mm,
just no. So I wanted to go into print, and discovering that was more about accepting all of me than trying to please my mother, which ultimately is what I realized had been a huge part of what I had been doing with who I selected,
mm.
all of those things. Although
Yeah.
I will say the guy I'm married to now, my mom would have just adored him.
And then there's a beautiful moment in your memoir, not to give it away for anyone who hasn't read it, but where you come into this experience of love, we can say, for your mother. That's feels like a real turning point in what you were looking for, at least for me as a reader.
Huge it was for me as a person too. I mean, so, and those experiences came after I had completed this version of the memoir again, that was just this framework of me at the silent meditation ashram, because the experience that I had as a result of that, like, and this, after you discover, oh my gosh, everything I'm looking at, it really is a story. Like there's a little narrative going on in my head, and I'm putting that on everything that I'm looking at all the time. And to see the depth of that was astonishing, but also empowering, because I could, take control of that narrative. But then you get in that point of, how do I not become a control freak, right?
Yeah. So I have a question for you about the end of the book. You, you leave one of the final scenes is around, you visiting this fortune teller, and it's very ironic. You're told that things won't go well or you won't find love in Florida, and well,
You
that's
will
where
always be alone.
when I was wondering as a reader, you don't tell us a lot about your new life in Florida and your love there. Tell us about why you don't give us a little bit more there. It feels like it could have been a conclusion to the story, but you just give a hint.
Oh, well, I actually have a perfect answer for that. And that is, I had found this happiness without him. So I had come to the end of that journey emotionally, spiritually, mentally on my own. And I never thought that, honestly, I didn't think that I would find someone. I figured, well, I'll just occasionally date, I'll have occasional bursts of dating, and it's fine. And I think that's really important, because one of the things that I discovered, and I remember going out and trying to sell my first book using these kinds of statistics, is like how many women choose to stay single, how common that is. And I've been single most of my adult life,
Mm.
right? Even though I'm on my second marriage, I've still been single more of my adult life than a married person. And even though I fully identify as a married person, I would not be here if it weren't for that journey. And I when I read stories where the answer is, and now I'm in a relationship, as if it's a happily, if it's as if happily ever after is the happy ending, I'm not satisfied,
Yeah.
because I think, well, what happens? And again, this is my, shaped by my own
Mm.
experience, but like, what happens if that person is no longer in your life?
Yeah.
Maybe you divorce, maybe they pass away. Like ultimately we come in and we go out on our own. So to me, the stories that involve finding your way on your own are more satisfying.
Okay.
So that was
I,
a definite choice. Although I did kind of want to give a nod to the current life that I have.
yeah, indeed. And I think the nod to the fortune teller was wrong, I thought.
Well, and okay, so that's the other irony, right? If you remember at the beginning, the fortune teller that I went to with my mom, we moved a lot around the Rust Belt, but a lot of times we were near this place called Greensburg in Western PA. And there was this one fortune teller, Miss Loretta, and we saw her over many years. And was the one who told me, you'll have two kids, but they won't be your own. And well, my current husband has two kids.
There you
So
go.
they're my stepkids, but
Yeah,
they're not mine.
yeah, but they're your kids through your family.
Right.
If there's one takeaway you want your readers to, or one message from your book, LL, what would it be?
It would be to look at what is right about yourself. Focus on what's right with you rather than what's wrong with you. So I realized at one point that if I kept searching for what was wrong with me, that was a never ending well. That was not going to stop, because nobody is perfect. I'm certainly not perfect. I do stupid things all the time. Yesterday, I got very little sleep, and at lunchtime, I wanted to. My spouse works from home, and I wanted to have lunch together. And I was trying to talk to him, and he was doing something else on his computer. So I finished making my lunch in a huff, and I stomped down the stairs. He's like, "What are you doing?" And I was like, "Well, if you're not going to talk to me, I don't want to sit here." And like a total huff. And I recognized, even luckily, I don't have to get stuck in that. See, that's the thing. Instead of saying like, "Oh, how could you be so terrible?" Blah blah blah. It's more like, "Oh yeah, I didn't really get much sleep last night, and I'm not in a good mood." And also, so it's probably good that I hid myself away in the office. Could have done it more skillfully. But
You're
I
human.
don't have to get stuck there. I think that's the problem. We tend to believe the bad stories.
Mm.
And I do believe that biologically we are kind of conditioned for this. We're conditioned to look for the dangers in the environment and try to address them with our behavior. But what happens, since we're not facing predatory threats, right, is it's just ourselves being mean to ourselves. And I really, one of the things meditation has helped me do, or mindfulness, even though because I practice different techniques, because I do find value in the practices, is that I can be much kinder to myself, and that is what radiates. Whenever I used to be the kind of person who would say, I'm harder on myself than anyone else.
Mm.
And that's not actually true. You're as hard on everybody else as you are on yourself. In
Yeah,
your thinking. So and I didn't realize that until I learned to actually be much softer and gentler on myself. And then it radiated outward without a lot of effort.
that makes sense. And I know you know what several different meditations, and you even have an offer, I think, on your website
I
for
do.
people who join your newsletter. So go look at llkirchner.com and join the newsletter. And I think you get a meditation suggestion based on your interests. Is that right? Are you offering that
Yes.
still at the moment?
Yes, that's still there. If you go to llkirchner.com/quiz, I created a quiz based on my experience of doing these different practices at different times in my life. Because when I stopped, for instance, chanting, I loved sound meditation, but I recognized that the actual vocalizing I didn't love, but
Oh,
a sound bath, very effective for me. So I kind of matched it to experiences and moods for myself that were satisfied by those experiences. So let me put it this way, it's not science. This is not science, but then none of it is.
none
You
of it
see,
is.
none of it is. I loved
Yay.
that part in your book where you talked about like these yoga poses are not like ancient 1,000-year-old postures. They've kind of emerged, and we give them this weird significance as a culture
Mm,
that I honestly believe even if you take medicine, like for some people, here's a great example, like codeine. I know that's supposed to be some kind of pain reliever. It does nothing for me. Nothing. It does not touch pain for me. But for
okay.
some people, they really feel it. And I think the same thing is true with all of these practices, which is why trying them on, testing them out, being open is great.
Yes.
But maintaining your own sense of self, most important. And I think the more that we shore up our beliefs in ourselves by, again, focusing on what we do right or what we do well, the less susceptible we are. If I'm constantly telling myself, oh, I'm so dumb, I'm confused, I don't know what's happening, da, 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 da. If somebody comes along and says, well, here is a program that you can try, I'm going to be much more susceptible to it than if I'm thinking, you know what? I'm doing a great job at getting through life and all this. Oh, look, this person has a program. Oh, I like some of the things that they say, but I don't, not the whole, everything.
Yeah. That's a real journey, LL, because I think some people it takes a while to get there and
Well,
not
it did take me a while.
but you've arrived. And what about your own yoga teaching? How do
Mm.
you present that to people, and how do you keep it open as you've just described?
Right. Well, right now, the only yoga teaching I'm doing is through workshops, and I have a couple of workshops coming up with this book. Because I work in live television, my schedule has not permitted it, except occasionally.
Okay.
I love teaching. I love teaching spelling. I love teaching yoga. And part of it is because I learn so much when I teach.
Mm,
I see what I don't know, and I also see what is of interest to people, like what has juice in the moment. What's really juicy right now might not be juicy 6 months from now,
yeah.
right? And it's this evolution that I get to participate in through interacting with other people.
Mm,
And so I think that is, I guess, how I stay open. I don't approach classes or anything really with the idea of, well, this is right and that is wrong, that is a huge difference from when I was younger. When I
yeah.
first, because when I was like a 20-year-old like person with a year of sobriety, I was like, oh yes, I have the answers now, right? What
Yes.
a moron I was. See, but even that was too mean. What a
Yeah.
silly person I was,
Yes.
right? Like
There is that certain, I can relate to that, being young and either searching, but also falling into things and being sure of them, that they
yes,
are the answer, and then
right.
waking up later. So I can really relate to, the journey.
Yeah. And I think that's why these stories are so important. I mean, you read a lot of stories about, for instance, addiction,
Yeah.
and a lot of it is the glamour of the going downhill or the craziness of the very early sobriety. And you don't see stories about, people with long-term recovery reckoning with the challenges of day-to-day life, because you still have that same thing. You still
Yeah.
have oh, I can't have a glass of wine to take the edge off. It still
Yeah.
has the same consequences, and you have to approach that problem in different ways as time goes on, because I'm not waking up in a pool of vomit and piss. So waking up in the morning with clean sheets, that doesn't really do it for me anymore. I don't think like you've really conquered this day. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Whereas 30 years ago, that would have been an achievement.
Yes. Yes. But I get that. Oh, anything else that you'd like to add before we close off? I, have we covered everything?
I love the fact that memoir gives us the opportunity to share true stories
Yeah,
because there are so many ways to look at the world. And I learn by reading other people's stories, which is why I loved your book, right? I just
thank you.
love seeing the world from somebody else's perspective. And I feel like I grow from that. And I hope I hope that that is a true experience people would have of either of my books, because I think that living in Qatar is not an experience that most people have, nor is living in India, although
Yeah,
for both of us, we have.
indeed, but it's good to show very different experiences and at different times of your life
Different
as
times of
well.
your life and different encounters, different responses to how we encountered those same, in some circumstances, those same places.
Yes. You do get up north, don't you, in the Kumbh Mela?
Yes.
But you're in Benares?
Yes.
Yes.
But there's a chapter that I cut about being in Rishikesh. I love Rishikesh. I really do. Do you still love it? Have you been back?
I haven't been back. My last trip there was in 2012. And
Oh, my last trip was in 2013.
oh, and I would be open to going back. I mean, I always thought that I would take Trevor there someday to show him, where I lived. Have you
Yeah.
have you gone with your spouse or
No, I
no?
think the same thing. I'm always like, oh, I got to take him there sometime. Like that, I would love to do that. I thought for a long time when I was teaching more, because I wasn't on live TV, I was always wanting to take a group of like yoga slash writers,
Yeah,
yogis slash writers to India, which I think would be a phenomenal.
yeah. I'm sure you may still do it.
Who knows?
Yes, but I would like to go back. I think publishing my book was the first step, and then, you know, going back. But I did have a cathartic experience. I think when you first go through an experience like mine, there were several years right after where there's a bit of a rejection to the whole thing. But part
Hmm.
of my healing was being like, I actually want to light a stick of incense. I really miss my curry, like my spicy food. I mean,
Yes.
and then feeling like, my bad encounter in no way reflects on a huge continent, many cultures, and so much that it has to offer. So, yes.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. Well, mine was like yours, it was very drawn out, and I did get something out of each experience I had. And my my take on it was not to again not to to really dive too deeply into what was wrong, although I do mention some of the more problematic
Yes.
things
And
about
people that you
different
met.
groups.
Mm,
But again, it's not, because there are some great books out there that really do kind of attack the wellness industry, so to speak, like the Gospel of Wellness. I'm trying to think. What, now they're all just floating out of my mind, but there are more traditional nonfiction
right.
titles that kind of survey the wellness industry, and it's a takedown. And that is not what I was interested in. That's not the story I was interested in telling. I didn't want to let them off the hook entirely, but I also wanted to share the experiences as they happened to me. And as I say, I think in the author's note at the beginning, when your heart is breaking, you are not you're not fact finding. Your
Mm,
rational mind is not super active.
right. Absolutely. And in terms of publishing your memoirs, did you go to a traditional publisher in the end? What was your path, and particularly with Blissful Thinking?
Yeah, well, the first book, I had an agent. I actually had two agents, but it ended up getting placed with a small press, so didn't go with an agent. But since then, I got the rights reverted back to me, and I did that in part so that I could use that book more promotionally.
Mm.
Because when you have the rights, if you put it out yourself, then you see basically the Amazon or the Ingram Spark
Oh, yes.
back end.
Yes.
These are, yeah. And so you can use it promotionally in that way. And this book also traditionally published, and that was very interesting. I had a couple of different agents for that. And the last agent that I had actually placed it with a small press, but then I ended up terminating that deal because I didn't feel that it was getting a strong enough developmental edit.
Okay.
And so I wasn't sure what I was going to do then. And then another small press expressed interest. So on my own, I did a developmental edit. I didn't really have the heart to go the agent route with it after I redid it, although, maybe I should have. But I had been working on that book for so long and I had gotten enthusiasm for this novel that I've written. I just kind of wanted to move that process forward more quickly because, as you know, searching for an agent takes a certain number of years. Getting signed, then you're in a path to publishing, which can be minimum 1 year. It can be 2 3 years long, right, depending on what they have open in their schedule, because publishing houses put out a limited number of books each year. And so I just didn't want to have this still out there because, as I told you, I had finished the first version of this book by 2016.
Mm. Yes, no, but good for you. And I just want to thank you so much. This has been a fascinating conversation. And thank you for
Thank you
being
so
open with
much.
us. And thank you so much for writing your memoir. I've read your more recent one. Now I'm going to be curious to read the other one because I have to say, I love your voice. And for people who haven't discovered your books, they're wonderful. And go and buy Blissful Thinking. You will enjoy it, you will laugh, and you will also learn something.
Thank you.
You